The Nativity of St. John, Chapter 3, Section 3. The feast of the Nativity of St. John is set down in the papal calendar for the 24th of June, or Midsummer Day. The very same period was equally memorable in the Babylonian calendar as that of one of its most celebrated festivals. It was midsummer, or the summer solstice, that the month called in Chaldea, Syria, and Phoenicia by the name of Tammuz began. And on the first day, that is, on or about the 24th of June, one of the grand original festivals of Tammuz was celebrated. See Stanley's Sabaean Philosophy. In Egypt, the month corresponding to Tammuz, Epep, began on June 25th. Wilkinson. For different reasons in different countries, other periods had been devoted to commemorate the death and reviving of the Babylonian god. But this, as may be inferred from the name of the month, appears to have been the real time when his festival was primitively observed in the land where idolatry had its birth. And so strong was the hold that this festival with its peculiar rites had taken off the minds of men, that even when other days were devoted to the great events connected with the Babylonian Messiah, as was the case in some parts of our own land, this sacred season could not be allowed to pass without the due observance of some, at least, of its peculiar rites. When the papacy sent its emissaries over Europe, towards the end of the 6th century, to gather in the pagans into its fold, this festival was found in high favor in many countries. What was to be done with it? Were they to wage war with it? No. This would have been contrary to the famous advice of Pope Gregory I, that by all means they should meet the pagans halfway, and so bring them into the Roman Church. The Gregorian policy was carefully observed, and so Midsummer Day, that had been hallowed by paganism to the worship of Tammuz, was incorporated as a sacred Christian festival in the Roman calendar. But still a question was to be determined. What was to be the name of this pagan festival, when it was baptized and admitted into the ritual of Roman Christianity? To call it by its old name of Bel or Tammuz at the early period when it seems to have been adopted would have been too bold. To call it by the name of Christ was difficult, inasmuch as there was nothing special in his history at that period of commemoration. But the subtlety of the agents of the mystery of iniquity was not to be baffled. If the name of Christ could not be conveniently tacked to it, what should hinder it being called by the name of his forerunner, St. John the Baptist? He was born 6 months before our Lord. When therefore the pagan festival of the winter solstice had once been consecrated as the birthday of the Saviour, it followed as a matter of course that if his forerunner was to have a festival, his festival must be at this very season, for between the 24th of June and 25th of December, that is, between the summer and winter solstice, there are just 6 months. Now for the purposes of the papacy, nothing could be more opportune than this. One of the many sacred names by which Tammuz or Nimrod was called when he reappeared in the mysteries after being slain was Oannes. Read Berosus, Bunzens, Egypt. To identify Nimrod with Oannes, mentioned by Berosus as appearing out of the sea, it will be remembered that Nimrod has been proved to be Bacchus. Therefore proof that Nimrod or Bacchus, on being overcome by his enemies, was fabled to have taken refuge in the sea, see chapter 4, section I. When therefore he was represented as reappearing, it was natural that he should reappear in the very character of Oannes as a fish god. Now Jerome calls Dagon, the well-known fish god, Piscem Moeroris, Bryant, the fish of sorrow, which goes far to identify that fish god with Bacchus, the lamented one, and the identification is complete when Hesychius tells us that some called Bacchus Ichthys, or the fish. The name of John the Baptist, on the other hand, in the sacred language adopted by the Roman Church, was Oannes. To make the festival of the 24th of June, then, suit Christians and pagans alike. All that was needful was just to call it the festival of Oannes, and thus the Christians would suppose that they were honoring John the Baptist, while the pagans were still worshipping their old god Oannes or Tammuz. Thus the very period at which the great summer festival of Tammuz was celebrated in ancient Babylon is at this very hour observed in the papal church as the feast of the Nativity of St. John, and the fête of St. John begins exactly as the festal day began in Chaldea. It is well known that in the East the day began in the evening. It's still in Jewish thought today it's the same. The Sabbath starts on Friday evening and goes to Saturday evening. So through the 24th be set down as the Nativity, yet it is on St. John's Eve, that is, on the evening of the 23rd, that the festivities and solemnities of that period begin. Now if we examine the festivities themselves, we shall see how purely pagan they are, and how decisively they prove their real descent. The grand distinguishing solemnities of St. John's Eve are the midsummer fires. These are lighted in France, Switzerland, in Catholic Ireland, and in some of the Scottish isles of the west, where Popery still lingers. They are kindled throughout all the grounds of the adherents of Rome, and flaming brands are carried about their cornfields. Thus does Bell, in his Wayside Pictures, describe the St. John's fires of Brittany in France. Every fête is marked by distinguished features peculiar to itself. That of St. John is perhaps on the whole the most striking. Throughout the day the poor children go about begging contributions for lighting the fires of Monsieur Saint Jean, and towards evening one fire is gradually followed by 2, 3, 4. Then 1,000 gleam out from the hilltops, till the whole country glows under the conflagration. Sometimes the priests light the first fire in the marketplace, and sometimes it is lighted by an angel, who is made to descend by a mechanical device from the top of the church, with a flambeau in her hand, setting the pile in a blaze and flying back again. The young people dance with a bewildering activity about the fires, for there is a superstition among them that if they dance round 9 fires before midnight, they will be married in the ensuing year. Seats are placed close to the flaming piles for the dead, whose spirits are supposed to come there for the melancholy pleasure of listening once more to their native songs, and contemplating the lively measures of their youth. Fragments of the torches on those occasions are preserved as bells against thunder and nervous diseases, and the crown of flowers which surmounted the principal fire is in such request as to produce tumultuous jealousy for its possession. Thus it is in France. Turn now to Ireland. On that great festival of the Irish peasantry, St. John's Eve, says Charlotte Elizabeth, describing a particular festival which she had witnessed, it is the custom at sunset on that evening to kindle immense fires throughout the country, built like our bonfires to a great height, the pile being composed of turf, bogwood, and such other combustible substances as they can gather. The turf yields a steady, substantial body of fire, the bogwood a most brilliant flame, and the effects of these great beacons, blazing on every hill, sending up volumes of smoke from every point of the horizon, is very remarkable. Early in the evening the peasants began to assemble, all habited in their best array, glowing with health, every countenance full of that sparkling animation and excess of enjoyment that characterized the enthusiastic people of the land. I had never seen anything resembling it, and was exceedingly delighted with their handsome, intelligent, merry faces, the bold bearing of the men, and the playful but really modest deportment of the maidens, the vivacity of the aged people, and the wild glee of the children. The fire being kindled, a splendid blaze shot up, and for a while they stood contemplating it with faces strangely disfigured by the peculiar light first emitted when the bogwood was thrown on it. After a short pause the ground was cleared in front of an old blind piper, the very beau ideal of energy, drollery, and shrewdness, who, seated on a low chair, with a well-plenished jug within his reach, screwed his pipes to the liveliest tunes, and the endless jig began. But something was to follow that puzzled me not a little. When the fire burned for some hours and got low, an indispensable part of the ceremony commenced. Every one present of the peasantry passed through it, and several children were thrown across the sparkling embers, while a wooden frame of some 8 feet long, with a horse's head fixed to one end, and a large white sheep thrown over it, concealing the wood and the man on horse head it was carried, made its appearance. This was greeted with loud shouts as the white horse, and having been safely carried by the skill of its bearer several times through the fire with a bold leap, it pursued the people, who ran screaming in every direction. I asked what the horse was meant for, and was told it represented all cattle. Here, adds the authoress, was the old pagan worship of Baal, if not of Moloch too, carried on openly and universally in the heart of a nominally Christian country, and by millions professing the Christian name. I was confounded, for I did not then know that Popery is only a crafty adaptation of pagan idolatries to its own scheme. Such is the festival of St. John's Eve as celebrated at this day in France and Popish Ireland. Such is the way in which the votaries of Rome pretend to commemorate the birth of him who came to prepare the way of the Lord, by turning away his ancient people from all their refuges of lies, and shutting them up to the necessity of embracing that kingdom of God that consists not in any mere external thing, but in righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Ghost. The history of the festival and the way in which it is observed reflect mutual light upon each other. Before Christianity entered the British Isles, the pagan festival of the 24th of June was celebrated among the Druids by blazing fires in honor of their great divinity, who, as we have already seen, was Baal. These midsummer fires and sacrifices, says Toland in his account of the Druids, were intended to obtain a blessing on the fruits of the earth, now becoming ready for gathering, as those of the 1st of May, that they might prosperously grow, and those of the last of October were a thanksgiving for finishing the harvest. Again, speaking of the Druidical fires at midsummer, he thus proceeds: "To return to our corn fires, it was customary for the lord of the place, or his son, or some other person of distinction, to take the entrails of the sacrificed animals in his hands, and walking barefoot over the coals thrice after the flames had ceased, to carry them straight to the Druid, who waited in a whole skin at the altar. If the nobleman escaped harmless, it was reckoned as a good omen, welcomed with loud acclamations; but if he received any hurt, it was deemed unlucky both to the community and himself. Thus I have seen," adds Toland, "the people running and leaping through the St. John's fires in Ireland, and not only proud of passing unsinged, but as if it were some kind of lustration, thinking themselves in a especial manner blessed by the ceremony, of whose original nevertheless they were wholly ignorant in their imperfect imitation of it. We have seen reason already to conclude that Phoroneus, the first of mortals that reigned, to mean Nimrod, and the Roman goddess Feronia bore a relation to one another. In connection with the furs of St. John, that relation is still further established by what has been handed down from antiquity in regard to these two divinities, and at the same time the origin of these fires is elucidated. Phoroneus is described in such a way as shows that he was known as having been connected with the origin of fire worship. Thus does Pausanias refer to him: "Near this image, the image of Beton, they the Argives enkindle a fire, for they do not admit that fire was given by Prometheus to man, but ascribe the invention of it to Phoroneus." There must have been something tragic about the death of this fire-inventing Phoroneus, who first gathered mankind into communities, for, after describing the position of his sepulchre, Pausanias adds: "Indeed, even at present they perform funeral obsequies to Phoroneus," language which shows that his death must have been celebrated in some such way as that of Bacchus. Then the character of the worship of Feronia, as coincident with fire worship, is evident from the rites practiced by the priests at the city lying at the foot of Mount Socracti, called by her name. "The priests," says Bryant, referring both to Pliny and Strabo as his authorities, "with their feet naked, walked over a large quantity of live coals and cinders." To this same practice we find Aruns in Virgil referring, when addressing Apollo, the sun god, who at his shrine at Soracte, where Feronia was worshipped, and who therefore must have been the same as Jupiter of Anxur, her contemplar divinity, who was regarded as a youthful Jupiter, even as Apollo was often called the young Apollo. "O patron of Soracte's high abodes, Phoebus, the ruling power among the gods, whom first we serve, whole woods of unctuous pine are felled for thee, and to thy glory shine. By thee protected with our naked souls, through flames unsinged we march and tread the kindled coals." Read Dryden's Virgile Aeneid. The young Apollo, when born to introduce law and order among the Greeks, was said to have made his appearance at Delphi, exactly in the middle of summer. Muller's Dorians. Thus the St. John fires, over whose cinders old and young are made to pass, are traced up to the first of mortals that reigned. It is remarkable that a festival attended with all the essential rites of the fire worship of Baal is found among pagan nations in regions most remote from one another, about the very period of the month of Tammuz when the Babylonian god was anciently celebrated. Among the Turks the fast of Ramazan, which, says Hurd, begins on the 12th of June, is attended by an illumination of burning lamps. Read Hurd's Rites and Ceremonies. The time here given by Hurd would not in itself be decisive as a proof of agreement with the period of the original festival of Tammuz, for a friend who has lived for 3 years in Constantinople informs me that in consequence of the disagreement between the Turkish and the solar year, the fast of Ramadan ranges, or Ramazan ranges, in succession through all the different months in the year. The fact of a yearly illumination in connection with religious observances, however, is undoubted. In China, where the Dragon Boat Festival is celebrated in such a way as vividly to recall to those who have witnessed it the weeping for Adonis, the solemnity begins at midsummer. In Peru, during the reign of the Incas, the feast of Raimi, the most magnificent feast of the Peruvians, when the sacred fire every year used to be kindled anew from the sun, by means of a concave mirror of polished metal, took place at the very same period. Regularly as midsummer came round, there was first, in token of mourning, for 3 days a general fast, and no fire was allowed to be lighted in their dwellings. And then on the 4th day the mourning was turned into joy, when the Inca and his court, followed by the whole population of Cuzco, assembled at early dawn in the great square to greet the rising of the sun. Eagerly, says Prescott, they watched the coming of the deity, and no sooner did his first yellow rays strike the turrets and loftiest buildings of the capital, then a shout of gratulation broke forth from the assembled multitude, accompanied by songs of triumph and the wild melody of barbaric instruments, that swelled louder and louder at his bright orb, rising above the mountain range towards the east, shone in full splendor on his votaries. Could this alternate mourning and rejoicing at the very time when the Babylonians mourned and rejoiced over Tammuz be accidental? As Tammuz was the sun divinity incarnate, it is easy to see how such mourning and rejoicing should be connected with the worship of the sun. In Egypt, the festival of the burning lamps, in which many have already been constrained to see the counterpart of the festival of St. John, was avowedly connected with the mourning and rejoicing for Osiris. At Sais, says Herodotus, they show the sepulchre of him whom I do not think it right to mention on this occasion. This is the invariable way in which the historian refers to Osiris, into whose mysteries he had been initiated, when giving accounts of any of the rites of his worship. It is in the sacred enclosure behind the temple of Minerva, and close to the wall of this temple, whose whole length it occupies. They also meet at Sais to offer sacrifice during a certain night, when every one lights in the open air a number of lamps around his house. The lamps consist of small cups filled with salt and oil, having a wick floating in it which burns all night. This festival is called the Festival of Burning Lamps. The Egyptians who are unable to attend also observe the sacrifice, and burn lamps at home, so that not only at Sais but throughout Egypt the same illumination takes place. They assign a sacred region for the festival celebrated on this night, and for the respect they have for it. Wilkinson, in quoting this passage of Herodotus, expressly identifies this festival with the lamentation for Osiris, and assures us that it was considered of the greatest consequences to do honor to the deity by the proper performance of this rite. Among the Yazidis, or devil worshippers of modern Chaldea, the same festival is celebrated at this day, with rites probably almost the same, so far as circumstances will allow, as thousands of years ago, when in the same regions the worship of Tammuz was in all its glory. Thus graphically does Mr. Layard describe a festival of this kind at which he himself had been present. As the twilight faded, the fakirs, or lower orders of priests, dressed in brown garments of Ko'ars cloth, closely fitting to their bodies, and wearing black turbans on their heads, issued from the tomb, each bearing a light in one hand and a pot of oil with a bundle of cotton wick in the other. They filled and trimmed lamps placed in niches in the walls of the courtyard, and scattered over the buildings on the sides of the valley, and even on isolated rocks and in the hollow trunks of trees. Innumerable stars appeared to glitter on the black sides of the mountain and in the dark recesses of the forest. As the priests made their way through the crowd to perform their task, men and women passed their right hands through the flame, and after rubbing the right eyebrow with the part which had been purified by the sacred element, they devoutly carried it to their lips. Some who bore children in their arms anointed them in like manner, whilst others held out their hands to be touched by those who, less fortunate than themselves, could not reach the flame. As night advanced, those who had assembled, they must now have amounted to nearly 5,000 persons, lighted torches which they carried with them as they wandered through the forest. The effect was magical. The varied groups could be faintly distinguished through the darkness, men hurrying to and fro, women with their children seated on the housetops, and crowds gathering round the peddlers who exposed their wares for sale in the courtyard. Thousands of lights were reflected in the fountains, and streams glimmered amongst the foliage of the trees and danced in the distance. As I was gazing on this extraordinary scene, the hum of human voices was suddenly hushed, and a strain sullen and melancholy arose from the valley. It resembled some majestic chant which years before I had listened to in the cathedral of a distant land. Music so pathetic and sweet I never before heard in the East. The voices of men and women were blended in harmony with the soft notes of many flutes. At measured intervals the song was broken by the loud clash of cymbals and tambourines, and those who were within the precincts of the tomb then joined in the melody. The tambourines, which were struck simultaneously, only interrupted at intervals the song of the priests. As the time quickened they broke in more frequently. The chant gradually gave way to a lively melody, which, increasing in measure, was finally lost in the confusion of sounds. The tambourines were beaten with extraordinary energy, the flutes poured forth a rapid flood of notes, the voices were raised to the highest pitch, the men outside joined in the cry, whilst the woman made the rocks resound with a shrill Ta'lel. The musicians, giving way to the excitement, threw their instruments into the air and strained their limbs into every contortion, until they fell exhausted to the ground. I never heard a more frightful yell than that which rose in the valley. It was midnight. I gazed with wonder upon the extraordinary scene around me. Thus were probably celebrated ages ago the mysterious rites of the Corybantes, when they met in some consecrated grove. Layard does not state at what period of the year this festival occurred, but his language leaves little doubt that he regarded it as a festival of Bacchus, in other words of the Babylonian Messiah, whose tragic death and subsequent restoration to life and glory formed the cornerstone of ancient paganism. The festival was avowedly held in honor at once of Shaykh Shems, or the sun, and of the Shaykh Adi, or Prince of Eternity, around whose tomb nevertheless the solemnity took place, just as the lamp festival in Egypt, in honor of the sun god Osiris, was celebrated in the precincts of the tomb of that god at Sais. Now the reader cannot fail to have observed that in this Yazidi festival men, women, children were purified by coming in contact with the sacred element of fire. In the rites of Zoroaster, the great Chaldean god, fire occupied precisely the same place. It was laid down as an essential principle in his system that he who approached to fire would receive a light from divinity. Read Taylor's Iamblichus, and that through divine fire all the stains produced by generation would be purged away. Read Proclus Timaeo. Therefore it was that children were made to pass through the fire to Moloch, Jeremiah 32:35, to purge them from original sin, and through this purgation many a helpless babe became a victim to the bloody divinity. Among the pagan Romans this purifying by passing through the fire was equally observed, for says Ovid, enforcing the practice, fire purifies both the shepherd and the sheep. Among the Hindus from time immemorial fire has been worshipped for its purifying efficacy. Thus a worshipper is represented by Colebrook according to the sacred books, as addressing the fire. Salutation to thee, O fire, who dost cease oblations, to thee who dost shine, to thee who dost scintillate, may the auspicious flame burn our foes. Mayst thou, the purifier, be auspicious unto us. There are some who maintain a perpetual fire, and perform daily devotions to it, and in concluding the sacraments of the gods, thus every day present their supplications to it. Fire, thou dost expiate a sin against the gods. May this oblation be efficacious. Thou dost expiate a sin against men. Thou dost expiate a sin against the manes, departed spirits. Thou dost expiate a sin against my own soul. Thou dost expiate repeated sins. Thou dost expiate every sin which I have committed, whether wilfully or unintentionally. May this oblation be efficacious. Among the Druids also fire was celebrated as the purifier. Thus in a Druidic song we read, "They celebrated the praises of the holy ones in the presence of the purifying fire, which was made to ascend on high." Read Davies's Druids, Song to the Sun. If indeed a blessing was expected in Druidical times from lighting the cairn fires and making either young or old, either human beings or cattle pass through the fire, it was simply in consequence of the purgation from sin that attached to human beings and all things connected with them, that was believed to be derived from this passing through the fire. It is evident that this very same belief about the purifying efficacy of fire is held by the Roman Catholics of Ireland when they are so zealous to pass both themselves and their children through the fires of St. John. Toland testifies that it is a lustration that these fires are kindled, and all who have carefully examined the subject must come to the same conclusion. I have seen parents, said the late Lord J. Scott in a letter to me, force their children to go through the balefires. Now if Tammuz was, as we have seen, the same as Zoroaster, the god of the ancient fire worshippers, and if his festival in Babylon so exactly synchronized with the feast of the Nativity of St. John, what wonder that that feast is still celebrated by the blazing balefires, and that it presents so faithful a copy of what was condemned by Jehovah of old in his ancient people when they made their children pass through the fire of Moloch. But who that knows anything of the gospel would call such a festival as this a Christian festival? The Pope priests, if they do not openly teach, at least allow their deluded votaries to believe, as firmly as ever ancient fire worshipper did, that material fire can purge away the guilt and stain of sin. How that tends to rivet upon the minds of their benighted vassals one of the most monstrous but profitable fables of their system will come to the afterward considered. The name Oannes could be known only to the initiated as the name of the pagan Messiah, and at first some measure of circumspection was necessary in introducing paganism into the Church. But as time went on, as the gospel became obscured and the darkness became more intense, the same caution was by no means so necessary. Accordingly, we find that in the Dark Ages the pagan Messiah has not been brought into the Church in a mere clandestine manner. Openly and avowedly under his well-known classic names of Bacchus and Dionysius, has he been canonized and set up for the worship of the faithful. Yes, Rome, that professes to be pre-eminently the bride of Christ, the only church in which salvation is to be found, has had the unblushing effrontery to give the grand pagan adversary of the Son of God under his own proper name a place in her calendar. The reader has only to turn to the Roman calendar and he will find that this is a literal fact. He will find that October 7th is set apart to be observed in honor of Saint Bacchus the Martyr. Saint Bacchus the Martyr. Now no doubt Bacchus was a martyr. He died a violent death. He lost his life for religion, but the religion for which he died was the religion of fire worshippers, for he was put to death, as we have seen from Maimonides, the Rambam, for maintaining the worship of the host of heaven. This patron of the heavenly host and of fire worship, for the two went always hand in hand together, has Rome canonized, for that this Bacchus the martyr was the identical Bacchus of the pagans, the god of drunkenness and debauchery, is evident from the time of his festival, for October 7th follows soon after the end of the vintage. At the end of the vintage in autumn, the old pagan Romans used to celebrate what was called the rustic festival of Bacchus, and about that very time does the papal festival of Saint Bacchus the Martyr occur. As the Chaldean god has been admitted into the Roman calendar under the name of Bacchus, so also is he canonized under his other name of Dionysius. The pagans were in the habit of worshipping the same god under different names, and accordingly, not content with the festival of Bacchus under the name by which he was most commonly known at Rome, the Romans, no doubt to please the Greeks, celebrated a rustic festival to him 2 days afterwards under the name of Dionysos Eleutherois, the name by which he was worshipped in Greece. That rustic festival was briefly called by the name of Dionysia, or, expressing its object more fully, the name became Festum Dionysii Eleutherae Rusticum, meaning the rustic festival of Dionysus Eleutherois. See in Begg's Handbook of Popery. Now the papacy, in its excess of zeal for saints and saint worship, has actually split Dionysos Eleutherois in two, has made 2 several saints out of the double name of one pagan divinity, and more than that, has made the innocent epithet Rusticum, which even among the heathen had no pretension to divinity at all, a third. And so it comes to pass that on the date of October the 9th we read this entry in the calendar: the festival of Saint Dionysos and of his companions, Saint Eleuter and Saint Rustic. Though Dionysos was the proper classic name of the god, yet in post-classical or Low Latin his name is found Dionysius, just as in the case of the Romish saint. Now this Dionysos whom Popery has so marvellously furnished with two companions, is the famed Saint Denis, the patron saint of Paris, Saint Denis, and a comparison of the history of the Popish saint and the pagan god will cast no little light on the subject. Saint Denis, on being beheaded and cast into the Seine, so runs the legend, after floating a space on its waters, to the amazement of the spectators, took up his head in his hand and so marched away with it to the place of burial. In commemoration of so stupendous a miracle, a hymn was duly chanted for many centuries in the Cathedral of Saint-Denis à Paris, containing the following verse: "The corpse immediately arose, the trunk bore away the dissevered head, guided on its way by a legion of angels," written in Salverte des Sciences Occultes. At least even Papists began to be ashamed of such an absurdity being celebrated in the name of religion, and in 1789 the office of Saint Denis was abolished. Behold, however, the march of events. The world has for some time past been progressing back again to the Dark Ages. The Romish breviary, which had been given up in France, has within the last 6 years been reimposed by papal authority on the Gallican Church with all its lying legends, and this among the rest of them. The Cathedral of Saint Denis is again being rebuilt, and the old worship bids fair to be restored in all its grossness. Now how could it ever enter the minds of men to invent such monstrous a fable? The origin of it is not far to see. The Church of Rome represented her canonized saints, who were said to have suffered martyrdom by the sword, as headless images or statues with a severed head borne in the hand. I have seen, says Eusèbe Salverte, in a church of Normandy, St. Clair, St. Mithra, at Arles, in Switzerland, all the soldiers of the Theban legion represented with their heads in their hands. St. Valerius is thus figured at Limoges on the gates of the cathedral and other monuments. The grand seal of the canton of Zurich represents, in the same attitude, St. Felix, St. Regula, and St. Exuperantius. There certainly is the origin of the pious fable which is told of these martyrs, such as Saint Denis and many others besides. This was the immediate origin of the story of the dead saint rising up and marching away with his head in his hand. But it turns out that this very mode of representation was borrowed from paganism, and borrowed in such a way as identifies the papal Saint Denis of Paris with the pagan Dionysus, not only of Rome but of Babylon. Dionysus, or Bacchus, in one of his transformations, was represented as Capricorn, the goat-horned fish, and there is reason to believe that it was in this very form that he had the name of Oannes. In this form in India, under the name Souro, that is evidently the seed. Zerah is seed in Hebrew. He is said to have done many marvelous things. For Oannes and Souro, now, in the Persian sphere he was not only represented mystically as Capricorn, but also in the human shape, and then exactly as Saint Denis is represented by the papacy. The words of the ancient writer who described this figure in the Persian sphere are these: Capricorn, the third decan, the half of the figure without a head, because its head is in its hand. Nimrod had his head cut off, and in commemoration of that fact, which his worshippers so piteously bewailed, his image in the sphere was so represented. That dissevered head, is some of the versions of his story, was fabled to have done as marvelous things as any that were done by the lifeless trunk of Saint Denis. Bryant has proved in the story of Orpheus that it is just a slightly colored variety of the story of Osiris. Bryant: the very name Orpheus is just a synonym for Baal, the name of the great Babylonian god, which, while originally given to Cush, became hereditary in the line of his deified descendants. Baal signifies to mix as well as to confound, and Orv in Hebrew, which in Chaldee becomes Orf, signifies also to mix. But Orv or Orf signifies besides a willow tree, and therefore, in exact accordance with the mystic system, we find the symbol of Orpheus among the Greeks to have been a willow tree. Thus Pausanias, after referring to a representation of Actaeon, says, if again you look to the lower parts of the picture, you will see, after Patroclus, Orpheus sitting on a hill with a harp in his left hand, and in his right hand the leaves of a willow tree. And again, a little further on, he says, he is represented leaning on the trunk of this tree. The willow leaves in the right hand of Orpheus, and the willow tree on which he leans sufficiently show the meaning of his name. As Osiris was cut in pieces in Egypt, so Orpheus was torn in pieces in Thrace. Now when the mangled limbs of the latter had been strewn about the field, his head floating on the Hebrus gave proof of the miraculous character of him that owned it. Then, says Virgil, then when his head from his fair shoulders torn, washed by the waters, was on Hebrus borne, even then his trembling voice invoked his pride. Bride, with his last voice, Eurydike, he cried. Eurydike, the rocks and rivers' banks replied. There is diversity here, but amidst that diversity there is an obvious unity. In both cases the head split away from the lifeless body occupies the foreground of the picture. In both cases the miracle is in connection with a river. Now when the festivals of St. Bacchus the martyr and of St. Dionysius and Eleuter so remarkably agree with the time when the festivals of the pagan god of wine were celebrated, whether by the name of Bacchus, Dionysos, or Eleuteros, and when the mode of representing the modern Dionysius and the ancient Dionysus are evidently the very same, while the legends of both so strikingly harmonize, who can doubt the real character of those Romish festivals? They are not Christian. They are pagan. They are unequivocally Babylonian. The reason for believing that Oannes, that was said to have been the first of the fabulous creatures that came up out of the sea and instructed the Babylonians, was represented as the goat-horned fish, is as followed. First, the name Oannes, as elsewhere shown, is just a Greek form of He Anesh, or the man. Enoshut means mankind in Hebrew, which is a synonym for the name of our first parent Adam. Now Adam can be proved to be the original of Pan, who was also called Inus, which is just another pronunciation of Anosh without the article, which in our translation of Genesis 5:7 is made Enosh. This name, as universally admitted, is the generic name for man after the fall, as weak and diseased. The O in Enos is what is called the vowel, which sometimes is pronounced O, sometimes U, and sometimes V or W. A legitimate pronunciation of Enos, therefore, is just Enus or NVS, the same in sound as Inuus, the ancient Roman name of Pan. The name Pan itself signifies he who turned aside. As the Hebrew word for uprightness signifies walking straight in the way, so every deviation from the straight line of duty was sin. Chata, the word for sin, signifying generically to go aside from the straight line. Pan, it is admitted, was the head of the satyrs, that is, the first of the hidden ones, for satire and satur, the hidden one, or shtul, are evidently just the same word, and Adam was the first of mankind that hid himself. Pan is said to have loved a nymph called Pitu, or as it is given in another form, Pitus, Reed, Smith, Pan. And what is Pitu or Pitus but just the name of the beguiling woman who, having been beguiled herself, acted the part of a beguiler of her husband, and induced him to take the step, in consequence of which he earned the name Pan, the man that turned aside. Lefanot or Anipone in Hebrew, Anipone means I turn aside, I turn. Pito or Pythis, Pitus, evidently come from peth or pet, to beguile, from which verb also the famous serpent Python derived its name. This conclusion in regard to the personal identity of Pan and Pito is greatly confirmed by the titles given to the wife of Faunus. Faunus, says Smith, is merely another name for Pan. In Semitic languages, F and P are interchangeable, so Pan and Fan is the same. In Chaldee, the same letter that is pronounced P is also pronounced PH, that is F, therefore Pan is just Faun. A Faun. Now the wife of Faunus was called Oma, Fauna, and Fatua, which names plainly mean the mother that turned aside, being beguiled. This beguiled mother is also called, indifferently, the sister, wife, or daughter of her husband, and how this agrees with the relations of Eve to Adam, the reader does not need to be told. Now a title of Pan was Capricornus, or the goat-horned, read Daimok Pan, and the origin of this title must be traced to what took place when our first parent became the head of the satyrs, the first of the hidden ones. He fled to hide himself, and Bercha, a fugitive, signifies also a he-goat. Hence, the origin of the epithet Capricornus or goat-horned as applied to Pan. But as Capricornus in the sphere is generally represented as the goatfish, if Capricornus represents Pan or Adam or Oannes, that shows that it must be Adam after, through virtue of the metempsychosis, he had passed through the waters of the deluge. The goat as the symbol of Pan, representing Adam, the first father of mankind, combined with the fish, the symbol of Noah, the second father of the human race, of both whom Nimrod, as at once Kronos, the father of the gods, and Sauron, from the Lord of the Rings, Sauron, and Zouro, the seed, was a new incarnation. Among the idols of Babylon, as represented in Kitto's illustrated commentary, we find a representation of this very Capricornus or goat-horned fish, and Berosus tells us that the well-known representations of Pan, of which Capricornus is a modification, were found in Babylon in the most ancient times. A great deal more of evidence might be adduced on this subject, but I submit to the reader if the above statement does not sufficiently account for the origin of the remarkable figure in the zodiac, the goat-horned fish. Chapter 3, Section 4, The Feast of the Assumption. If what has been already said shows the carnal policy of Rome at the expense of truth, the circumstances attending the festival of the Assumption show the daring wickedness and blasphemy of that church still more, considering that the doctrine in regard to this festival, so far as the papacy is concerned, was not established in the Dark Ages, but 3 centuries after the Reformation, amid all the boasted light of the 19th century. The doctrine on which the festival of the Assumption is founded is this: that the Virgin Mary saw no corruption, that in body and soul she was carried to heaven, and now is invested with all power in heaven and earth. This doctrine has been unblushingly avowed in the face of the British public, in a recent pastoral of the Popish Archbishop of Dublin. This doctrine has now received the stamp of papal infallibility, having been embodied in the late blasphemous decree that proclaims the Immaculate Conception. Now it is impossible for the priests of Rome to find one shred of countenance for such a doctrine in Scripture, but in the Babylonian system the fable was ready-made to their hand. There it was taught that Bacchus went down to hell, rescued his mother from the infernal powers, and carried her with him in triumph to heaven. Apollodorus. We have seen that the great goddess who was worshipped in Babylon as the mother was in reality the wife of Ninos, the great god, the prototype of Bacchus. In conformity with this, we find a somewhat similar story told of Ariadne, the wife of Bacchus, as is fabled of Semele, his mother. The garment of Thetis, says Bryant, contained a description of some notable achievements in the first ages, and a particular account of the apotheosis of Ariadne, who is described, whatever may be the meaning of it, as carried by Bacchus to heaven. A similar story is told of Alcmene, the mother of the Grecian Hercules, who was quite distinct, as we have seen, from the primitive Hercules, and was one of the forms of Bacchus, for he was a great tippler, and the Herculean goblets are proverbial. Read in Muller's Dorians. Now the mother of this Hercules is said to have had resurrection. Jupiter, the father of Hercules, says Muller, raised Alcmene from the dead, and conducted her to the islands of the blessed, as the wife of Rhadamanthus. This fable spread wherever the Babylonian system spread, and accordingly at this day the Chinese celebrate, as they have done from time immemorial, a festival in honor of a mother who by her son was rescued from the power of death and the grave. The festival of the Assumption in the Romish Church is held on the 15th August. The Chinese festival, founded on a similar legend and celebrated with lanterns and chandeliers, as shown by Sir J. F. Davis in his able and graphic account of China, is equally celebrated in the month of August. Now when the mother of the pagan Messiah came to be celebrated as having been thus assumed, then it was that under the name of the Dove she was worshipped as the incarnation of the Spirit of God, with whom she was identified. As such, as she was regarded as the source of all holiness and the grand purifier, and of course was known herself as the Virgin Mother, pure and undefiled. Read Proclus in Taylor's Note upon Jamblichus. under the name of Proserpine, with whom, though the Babylonian goddess was originally distinct, she was identified. While celebrated as the mother of the first Bacchus, and known as Pluto's honored wife, she is also addressed in the Orphic hymns as associate of the seasons, essence bright, all-ruling virgin, bearing heavenly light. Whoever wrote these hymns, the more they are examined, the more does it become evident, when they are compared with the most ancient doctrines of classic Greece, that their authors understood and thoroughly adhered to the genuine theology of paganism. To the fact that Proserpine was currently worshipped in pagan Greece, though well known to be the wife of Pluto, the god of hell, under the name of the Holy Virgin, we find Pausanias, while describing the grove Carnasius, thus bearing testimony. This grove contains a statue of Apollo Carneus, of Mercury carrying a ram, and of Proserpine, the daughter of Ceres, who is called the Holy Virgin. The purity of this Holy Virgin did not consist merely in freedom from actual sin, but she was especially distinguished for her immaculate conception. For Proclus says, she is called Chori, through the purity of her essence and her undefiled transcendency in her generations. Do men stand amazed at the recent decree? There is no real reason to wonder. It was only in following out the pagan doctrine previously adopted and interwoven with the whole system of Rome to its logical consequences that that decree has been issued, and that the Madonna of Rome has been formally pronounced at last in every sense of the term absolutely immaculate. Now after all this, is it possible to doubt that the Madonna of Rome with the child in her arms and the Madonna of Babylon are one and the same goddess? It is notorious that the Roman Madonna is worshipped as a goddess, yea, is the supreme object of worship. Will not then the Christians of Britain revolt at the idea of longer supporting this monstrous Babylonian paganism? What Christian constituency could tolerate that its representatives should vote away the money of this Protestant nation for the support of such blasphemous idolatry? It is to be lamented that Christians in general seem to have so little sense either of the gravity of the present crisis of the Church and the world, or of the duty lying upon them as Christ's witnesses, to testify, and that practically, against the public sins of the nation. If they would wish to be stimulated to a more vigorous discharge of duty in this respect, let them read an excellent and well-timed little work recently issued from the press, entitled An Original Interpretation of the Apocalypse, where the apocalyptic statements in regard to the character, life, death, and resurrection of the two witnesses are briefly but forcibly handled. Were not the minds of men judicially blinded, they would tremble at the very thought of incurring the guilt that this land, by upholding the corruption and wickedness of Rome, has for years past been contracting. Has not the word of God in the most energetic and awful terms doomed the New Testament Babylon, and has it not equally declared that those who share in Babylon's sins shall share in Babylon's plagues? Revelation 18:4. The guilt of idolatry is by many regarded as comparatively slight and insignificant guilt, but not so does the God of heaven regard it. Which is the commandment of all the 10 that is fenced about with the most solemn and awful sanctions? It is the second. Thou shalt not make unto thee a graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, in the earth beneath, or in the water, and thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, to the 3rd and 4th generation. These words were spoken by God's own lips, they were written by God's own finger on the tablets of stone, not for the instruction of the seed of Abram only, but of all the tribes and generations of mankind. No other commandment has such a threatening attached to it as this. Now if God has threatened to visit the sin of idolatry above all other sins, and if we find the heavy judgment of God pressing upon us as a nation, while this very sin is crying to heaven against us, ought it not to be a matter of earnest inquiry if among all our other national sins, which are both many and great, this may not form the very head and front of our offending? What though we do not ourselves bow down to stocks and stones, yet if we, making a profession the very opposite, encourage and foster and maintain that very idolatry which God has so fearfully threatened with his wrath, our guilt, instead of being the less, is only so much the greater, for it is a sin against the light. Now the facts are manifest to all men. It is notorious that in 1845 anti-Christian idolatry was incorporated in the British Constitution in a way in which for a century and a half it had not been incorporated before. It is equally notorious that ever since, the nation has been visited with one succession of judgment after another. Ought we then to regard this coincidence as merely accidental? Ought we not rather to see in it the fulfillment of the threatening pronounced by God in the Apocalypse? This is at this moment an intensely practical subject. If our sin in this matter is not nationally recognized, if it is not penitently confessed, if it is not put away from us, if on the contrary we go on increasing it, if now, for the first time since the Revolution, while so manifestly dependent on the God of battles for the success of our arms, we affront him to his face by sending idol priests into our camp, then, though we have national fasts and days of humiliation without number, they cannot be accepted. They may procure us a temporary respite, but we may be certain that the Lord's anger will not be turned away, his hand will be stretched out